Because the reality is, if Africa should create an urban condition or an industrialized state as what's happening in the rest of the world, then we might as well just all go and die. To be able to develop that same scale of capital creation, it involves either the exploitation of land, exploitation of resource, or exploitation of labor. If you don't have these three things, you cannot create the same scale of development that has been received by these regions. And we don't have these. So we just can't replicate it. So if we don't think realistically about creating another an urban condition that works off a different model, it just really is never attainable. But I think an important point to note is that Kalurati decided to approach this exhibition as an open call. But what I really enjoyed about his curatorial theme was obviously this idea of circularity. And specifically by categorizing it in different tracks, this idea of collective really stood strongly to me in terms of what I was looking at with the markets. The markets generally are really beautiful extracts from tradition, which coming from tradition, we consider them as informal in today's world because they don't come necessarily from a top-down kind of narrative. And the idea of collective is that there are many people involved in creating them, but without anyone specifically setting the direction. And I think this is the important point to note. What I really enjoyed also in the early parts of this research, I realized that this idea of collective and the markets in Lagos is very strongly tied to the fact that none of these markets are formally planned or structured by the state. They tend to occur in parts of the city where maybe there's a cross of intersections for logistics, or there is an interesting origin story to why the market has been situated in wherever it is placed. In some cases, it's the taking over of existing residentials that have now become commercial. In some cases, it's white field sites. In some cases, it's brown field sites. But what's fascinating is that none of them occur because there is a top-down entity. Now, in the early days of my research into the markets and what actually sparked my interest was if you look at like any standard food market, ephemeral food markets in Lagos, where people literally bring out their stalls in the morning and take them away in the evening, if you have an aerial view, you will start to see convergences. So you will get all the tomato people stay together, you'll get all the fish people stay together, you'll get all the meat people stay together. And it's actually because these markets are based on a barter system. There's no fixed price. So there's actually an efficiency that occurs when people of like product stay together. And so this I found quite fascinating because some people would say, oh, why would you stay next to your competition? But in actual fact, if somebody's looking for tomatoes and they go to that region, by the time they barter with everyone, they will get somebody who they will agree and align on price. And so the market realizes there's an efficiency from being together because somebody will get that business. And the consumer also has the efficiency of just going to one point of location of sale. Now, if you take this across the specialist markets, so this is now moving it up a tier to the city level, I started to see this convergence also happening across different market type. So whether you're selling secondhand clothes, whether you're selling electronics or car parts, you start to get these convergences of mass and efficiency that comes from everyone being located in similar regions. And, relating that to a city that from, I guess, the 50s, 60s, 70s had a very formal, intended style of development. And due to the economic challenges of the structural adjustment programs that happened in the 1980s, when a lot of African countries had gained independence and had borrowed money and were now beginning to struggle with paying the money back, you start to see the formation of these entities, which was a pause of top-down structure development and then the reality of what happens when you allow market forces to take control themselves. And I thought that that was really exciting. Now, relating this series of situations back to the theme, which was really looking at predominantly how we can deal with circularity, or how circularity can be part of the solutions towards our climate crisis. What I also found is a lot of these markets that operate in West Africa and Lagos specifically are also dealing with the reality of ensuring that the populace of these cities can exist in modernity. And when I say exist in modernity, I'm now talking about this idea of consumer goods. Nigeria's currency has devalued over 700% since 2005. You know, several of these products that we take for granted everywhere in the world today, a mobile phone, a car, clothing, become quite difficult to acquire when your currency is always devaluing. But the reality is that we all exist in modernity. Everyone needs a phone. Everyone needs to get dressed. You know, the way we dress is completely different. Lagos doesn't have a quite advanced public transport system. So the reality is most people still get from A to B via car. But in a country where people can't afford a brand new car, what does that mean? You know, how is vehicular kind of transportation a reality? And so what happens in these markets is these markets are actually at the forefront of ensuring that the populace can exist in modernity. And then what becomes quite fascinating is how they are moving goods that are considered close to waste or end of life from the global north, bringing them into Nigeria. And then what's fascinating is that these markets are actually now points of production. They now become factories. They take end of life products, and through a process of adaptation and reappropriation in the market structure, they go from point A to final point of sale at B. And usually with some kind of adaptation or improvement placed on them so that they become desirable end products to be consumed. This actually means that these markets are at the forefront of really an idea of circularity, taking end of life redundant products and extending life. And I think, you know, when we think about where we sit in the world today with our climate crisis, where we have a hyper consumerist culture, which is encouraged by capitalism and encourages a layer of redundancy so that we continue to buy, and buy and buy. It's this beautiful narrative of what's happening on the continent where, you know, these regions who can't afford these first-hand products are actually at the foreground of understanding and extending these products, you know. And then it also makes you think, well, if these products can be extended, why is the capitalist narrative encouraging the counter of that? When in reality, it is this hyper-consumerism which is also fueling the challenges with our climate. So it's a very beautiful layered story of resilience, of innovation, and I guess, again, collective intelligence about how at the level of city, you start to see these efficiencies that occur, not because anyone planned them, but because they naturally kind of manifest due to a series of socioeconomic and political conditions. At the early stages of this exhibit, and like I said, it's the birth of research that is actually had started but is very much ongoing. I really struggled with using the word informal because, to be honest, in Nigeria, this is our formal. There is nothing else. But when you speak about it in a global kind of environment, you need to use terminology that people understand. But I also didn't want to negate or make it appear backward or primitive by using the word informal. So I think that, first of all, was the reason why alternatives seem to be a more appropriate description. So much of what happens in the market structure comes from tradition. And I think the more I research and develop a pedagogy concerning this topic, I think the word tradition is more appropriate. So I've done quite a bit of research into the history of markets in my region. And the market has always been a very strong, important aspect of any form of collective life, from a village to a town. What we used to have prior were market days, but they would always be located in places that would have been considered squares. But you would have the market come out. They would have 5 to 7 day cycles, usually also based on Yoruba mythology, which is also very important. The market would always have a shrine associated with it. So this was a very important, significant part of society in any form of so they, particularly in Ife, where the Yoruba people originate from, there is a festival that is done, I think, once a year, where the king actually has to through a series of activities that he needs to carry out, he has to pass through the market. So the market is considered very important. In addition to this, within Yoruba mythology, there is a saying, Aye Loja or Runile, and it's usually a saying that is said or a song that is sung when somebody is bereaved and to comfort the family. The idea that the soul passes through the market on its way to the afterlife. It's got so much divine importance in society. But as Nigeria continued to develop, or what eventually became Nigeria developed, it was the place of political movement. It's always been the place of gathering. It's always been the place of announcements, from any kind of structured organization, from the king or from a council. And also even the idea of how the market structure has worked predates this capitalist narrative that we exist in. So traditionally and through language in Yoruba, the person who sells is considered the customer and not the seller. Because the idea was that you would build a relationship with someone who maybe you buy fish or meat from on a regular basis. And so the person who is consuming the product would actually say, I'm going to see my customer, who is the person who's actually selling, which completely negates this whole approach of how we understand the capitalist system. And back then, you would not sell to make profit. You would sell to make enough money to be able to purchase another product, which is closer to a Marxist system without the state structure of Marxism. So, when we start to think about this idea of the market and the activity that it would have supported in everyday life, you see that it's much more than just an urban condition. There's so many places in the world who also experience these conditions, but because we're always focused on this only way of living in modernity, we don't actually value and understand how important these are. And I think just to add to this conversation about the importance of tradition, something else that we were looking at, in relation to this research is the very interesting urban condition that happens in Africa, where you have a lot of regions that are urbanized, but because of obviously political and economic conditions, they're not industrialized. And so when we think about the African continent in general, in 2023, the whole of the African continent only contributed 3.75 to global carbon emissions. 3.75%. It is absolutely nothing. The whole of Nigeria, with its 220 million people, contributed just 0.31%. So the reality is, you have these places that are very heavily urbanized, not industrialized, but they were at the foreground of really thinking about circularity, not out of an initial desire, but actually out of a must, out of a necessity. But that makes you question also what really is important. How do we measure our understanding of prosperity? And what really is the implication of this prosperity on our climate, on our carbon contribution, when there are regions of the world who are doing so much more with less? This project, its special mention, is contributing towards, the global North learning from the global South. I have seen a video in Nigeria of a guy who took an iPhone 11 and converted it to an iPhone Pro Max 13. This guy literally just opened the phone. He understands, they always tell us you can't open your iPhone. and he and it's all working. I think the point is, I mean, this is a funny story to say, but I think in reality, the challenges that we face are so dire. I guess it's the young generation who are really shouting and panicking that, look, we really need to change the way we live. So much of the world today is the problem. The biggest issue is our perception of progress. And if we can change that, I think we are closer to finding a realistic solution to some of the world's biggest problems. And the regions of the world who are at the foreground of this are the places that are working with scarcity, not because they want to, but because they've had to. So one, there are two mindsets that need to change. We have to change the mindset of the people in the global south to actually realize that they are at the correct end of progress. And then we have to change the mindsets of people in the global north, where all the conveniences of modernity have been afforded, where you have people who have homes or they have wardrobes as big as some people's apartments for just clothes and shoes. Who needs 15 to 30 or 50 pairs of trainers? You can't wear them all at the same time. Who needs to have all these consumerist products? So much of modernity has provided so much opulence for things that we don't need, and I'm not saying that we should all live in a socialist kind of reality where you just get what you need, because that as a governing system has also not worked. But I do think we really need to rethink our value system. And we have to make sure that the regions who are at the foreground of understanding this importance of circularity understand and value what they are contributing to the world. And for the regions who are the biggest end of creating waste, to understand that we need to close this gap. And I almost see a world where the regions that have been at the foreground of circularity become more important, because if they're the ones who are being able to understand and develop technologies that allow us to complete the circle of waste, then they should now become the pioneers as opposed to those that are producing the most. We may not be at that point where it's completely seen as dire, but it's very interesting to see how this innovation is happening and people are becoming quite sophisticated in how they deal with this idea of circularity. And how valuable could this be in a global economy in the future? Could this be Africa's comparative advantage to the world? The fact that they have been able to develop a very sophisticated way of extending life of consumer goods. How do we take this forward? What's the solution with all this information? The reality is, for several of these regions, you have informal and formal existing, and almost like two different seas with like a very sharp border. How do you bridge these worlds? The nation state, the modern city, exists in a formal structure. We have several situations where these worlds don't cross, but in reality, we have to find a way to kind of coexist. I've mapped these markets and it's like, okay, what next? What do you do with this information? We have a very potentially economic and political tension that exists with these markets because the state is trying to formalize them. The state is trying to formalize them because within the modern system of society, for us all to benefit from the state and the commons of the state, you need everyone to pay tax. The big challenge is that these systems exist outside of the formal system. So in effect, these people are not taxed. And if these people are not taxed, and in Nigeria, 58% of Nigeria's economy is informal, how do you realistically have any form of development or shared of the commons when so many people are not contributing towards it? And it puts strain on the people who are. What ends up happening is the people who are within the formal system are like, why am I going to pay this much tax? I'm going to try and evade as much tax as possible, because whether I pay or not, nothing gets done because not everyone is contributing. So we have this kind of chicken and egg awkward situation. But, I've spoken to, people, particularly in the business school, is How do you bridge that world? So much of what happens in Nigeria has been trying to formalize the informal. I think we need to live with the reality that these two worlds are going to always coexist. It's not been successful to erase them. And in reality, I think we need to find ways to harmonize them. And I think this could be done with technology. For example, with the markets, I spoke to quite a few people, questionnaires with the market unions. There are no records. How do I, as a designer, even propose anything of development when I'm not working with numbers? I'm working with feelings. I'm working with observations. I'm working with mappings, but I still have no numbers. These numbers don't exist. How can I collate this data? If I have this information, then I can propose more sustainable development, because these entities are going to continue to exist, but they also have some inefficiencies. How do you improve the inefficiencies and make them work better without having the information? So, this is also what my research is bringing to my mind, that until there is an avenue to formally, or let's not use the word formally, to collate data that allows me to see from a numbers scheme what's happening here, why it's viable, why it's efficient, and also what's not working. To be able to say, let's now create interventions that improve the inefficiencies to make these things more viable as systems of development that are very much from tradition, but can continue in that trajectory. And I think that's why I'm looking forward to being able to develop this further. I love it. I'll be honest. I think so obviously before Sharjah, I had co-curated Lagos Biennial, but I think what I found really refreshing about having diversity of practice is everything informs everything. And I think it's helped me to be a better practitioner. I have a much higher consciousness of the responsibility of the kind of buildings that we deliver. I think it's also made me a more realistic theoretical thinker, because I'm also dealing with the reality of execution. The worst thing you can have is somebody who's sat in a bubble, who doesn't understand the real world in relation to the theories that they're creating. And I think it's made me a much happier person, because I have these different avenues that I almost use different parts of my brain to kind of exist in. What I've really enjoyed, particularly at at Harvard, is because I have such a diversity of practice. I wear many hats. I mean, I understand business, and this is important for life. I understand the importance of history, the role it plays in the formation of the decisions we make today. I have a very good understanding and interest in developmental economics, which is not necessarily the realm of the architect, but if I understand this world, it helps me to think as an urban thinker, at the city scale. So, having the flexibility to wear these hats, and to be honest, it can be very, I don't sleep very much, but I do really feel that knowledge build is so important and really very powerful. And I know as a designer, as a thinker, having concentration in these different realms really has co-informed, my practice. And I'd spoken to a friend recently who said, I think this is the reason why so many people teach, because having that space in the classroom and having that space in design practice are so important, because everything feeds off each other. Nothing ever is done in isolation. And in a situation where I haven't had the opportunity to teach in Nigeria, having this space of curation and thought leadership in relation to practice has been very important. Sometimes knowing how dire something is can be very challenging, because you also are aware that some things are just not going to work. I think one of the biggest things I took from even a history on capitalism course I took at the business school, I realized that a lot of African leaders are promising things they can never deliver. And I think, when you realize that they mean well, but actually they cannot economically deliver. The numbers, the maths doesn't work. I think just by virtue of the exhibit and it's very important for me that the work shared a very positive narrative. Very early on, when I got the selection, was okay, what's going to be the best way to represent this? How am I going to show this to the world, especially when I didn't have data? We were able to do mapping studies. I thought that by mapping, we would be able to start to see, in some cases, zonings of maybe the factory process, but it's all over the place. But that was in itself an understanding of this condition, that it happens within the entity of this convergence. There may be also not as much order as I had imagined. It was very important to share a positive narrative that would help people to feel, who live in these conditions, a celebratory reality. Very early on, there was a possibility of showing this as purely a photography exhibition, but I became quite mindful. And also, this was what was really great about doing this exercise during my fellowship year was I had a wide group of people that I could also bounce ideas off. And, it became very clear to me very early on that, a friend of a colleague of my fellowship said, oh, he always gets quite concerned when he sees these pictures or deprivation from Africa. And I thought, oh gosh, a still image can be interpreted in many different ways. And in many situations where these places look messy and disorganized, it may not be something that is seen as aspirational or desirable or progressive. And so that was why it was decided maybe the best way to represent this would be to create something immersive and about film that makes these people look good, that would make somebody who comes from this place proud. And that messaging in itself is very powerful. And I feel that we were able to achieve that. It's very important to me that this is not seen as backward and this is not seen as negative. I live in Lagos. I'm very proud of where I live. I'm very proud of where I'm from. I know it has many problems, but I believe I'm also part of the solution. And I think to have more people from these regions who share positive narratives is very important. And I hope that I am part of that generation of people who are really trying to move things forward in a progressive manner.